Today is Wednesday, June the 1st, 2022, and today's devotional is titled, God's Judgment of Egypt. Now, our scripture reading, Ezekiel chapter 30 and Ezekiel chapter 31. And we are continuing our study of the prophecies of Ezekiel, and we're finding ourselves now in the midst of God's declaration of judgment on the nations, with the subject in this chapter being that of Egypt. Now, the date of this prophecy that we find in the opening verses of Ezekiel 30 is not given, but there's good reason to believe that it would have followed Ezekiel 29 and verse 1, which was the 10th year of Ezekiel's exile in Babylon. Now, in Ezekiel 30, we have the third of 7 judgments that Ezekiel prophesied against the nations of the earth. Now, notice, if you would, in verses 1 through 9, what I'm describing as a storm of God's judgment. We read there where the Lord comes to Ezekiel and he says to him, when he says to prophesy, he says, "Howl ye, woe worth the day," or "Oh no, the day of the Lord is near, a day of clouds." Now, with Jerusalem already under siege, the people in Babylon were waiting for news of their countrymen, of their families, and of that great city. Ezekiel was told, even with that siege against Jerusalem, he was told to prophesy also against the nations. Particularly, you'll find in verse 5, it was the nation of Egypt that was doomed. Now, why was she to be judged? Well, verse 6 through 7, Egypt's pride and her strength would fail, we read. Her lands and her cities would be laid waste. The Egyptians, and here's God's purpose in verse 8 and 9, would know it was the Lord, even as her cities burned. In fact, the news of Egypt's fall, we read, would reach the land of Ethiopia in verse 9, and they would be so terrified that they would say of God's judgment, "Lo," verse 9, "it cometh." Now, notice then in verse 10 through 19, we're again introduced to Nebuchadnezzar as the agent or the servant of God. Now, he was the agent of God's wrath. And so Ezekiel was to declare the multitude of Egypt would come to an end as the people were slain and the Egyptians would be driven out of their land. Do you ever wonder how the sands of Egypt covered all of their monuments and covered their pyramids until recent, the last 2 centuries, when archaeologists have been uncovering them? Well, it's because all the people had been taken away out of the land and had been laid waste. In fact, you read in verses 12, the rivers, the streams, the irrigation canals flowing for the Nile River would be destroyed. The nation would be plundered. The great cities of Egypt would become ruins. They would be left desolate, and the people would know and confess, verse 19, the Lord as sovereign. Now notice verse 20 through 26. And here we have the strength of Pharaoh and that it would fail. Ezekiel 30 and verse 20 introduces the fourth judgment of the Lord, which we'll find in chapter 31. Now it was, here is the date given, in the 11th year of Ezekiel's exile, or it might be more properly said, King Jehoiachin's exile. Now, the Lord prophesied regarding Pharaoh in verse 21, and he says, "I have broken the arm of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and lo, it shall not be bound up to be healed." In other words, the arms of Pharaoh, representing the strength of Egypt, would be broken and not reset. For that reason, verse 21 and through 22, Egypt would never again be able to rule the world and rise up and rule over other nations. In fact, we read in verse 24 that Pharaoh would groan with the groanings of a deadly wounded man. And so this judgment brought upon Egypt, represented in Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, would humiliate that great nation. Now, you're going to notice as you come to Ezekiel 31, there's a little bit of a difference in the approach here, because now the nation of Assyria, now defeated by Babylon, was held up as an example and a lesson to Egypt. And particularly as you read in verse 2, a warning to Pharaoh. Now, I'm not going to take much time with this other than invite you to look at verse 3. You see Assyria as a nation portrayed as a great cedar in Lebanon. Now, the pride of that nation and the power and the strength of that nation is represented in verses 4 through 5 as that great cedar towering over all the other trees of the forest, which were the nations and the people. Now, as the Nile River had been nourished Egypt, we also read in verses 4 and 5 that the rivers and streams of Assyria had nourished her fields and forests. Now, verse 6, continuing that portrayal of Assyria as a great cedar tree, we read that the nations of the world sought shelter, and I quote, in her branches, even in times of famine, like it was in Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. And we see that when Joseph's brothers come down from Canaan into Egypt to get grain. Now, the Assyrians boasted that they were the greatest nation. They excelled all other nations. And for that boasting, they even went so far in verse 8 through 9 to say that even greater than the trees of Eden that were in the garden of God. Well, we read verse 10 through 17 now. Assyria's fate, which is a warning and a lesson to Egypt. As the mighty Assyrian cedar fell, Egypt's pride would also suffer a crushing defeat as the Lord delivered Pharaoh into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Assyria had been a sinful, wicked, ruthless nation. In verse 12 through 13, she would suffer the same fate herself. Now, verse 14, though Nebuchadnezzar was God's agent, it was the Lord who determined all who lift up their proud hearts would, and I quote, go down to the pit. Where's the pit? The pit is hell. And so now we understand that the Lord would stop up, in verse 15, the rivers of Egypt and the rivers as he had the rivers of Assyria. The crops would fail. The trees of the field would faint. In fact, when the news of Assyria's downfall spread and reached some of the other nations of the world, we read in verse 16, they trembled for fear. You see, the Lord condemned Assyria to hell, and her allies knew they would follow. Here's a closing thought. 31, verse 18, the fall of Assyria would serve as God's warning to Egypt. Ezekiel foretold, as it was with Assyria, so it would befall Egypt. Here's a warning. People and nations who exalt themselves against the God of heaven will be sentenced to hell, or as we read in verse 18, unto the nether parts of the earth. What a great God we worship, the great God we serve. Let us not fear of the day that we live in, knowing our times are in God's hand. God bless and bye-bye.